A gray autumn haze enveloped the suburb of Glenville as Sabina Williams and her husband Khalil Wright stepped onto the front porch of their newly renovated two-story home. This house, with its manicured garden and neatly painted facade, was a symbol of their married life. But none of the neighbors realized that the beginning of this story dates back to the school corridors, where the two teenagers first felt mutual sympathy and built a special bond. In fact, it all started long before their wedding and successful careers. Sabina and Khalil saw each other in high school, and almost from the first day they felt that they shared a common desire for self-development and high dreams. Back then, when they were still 15, they would help each other with their homework, discuss books on economics or psychology, and at the same time find sincere joy in their conversations. Khalil quickly realized how hardworking and curious Sabina was about new knowledge. She could read a series of articles about marketing and then retell them with such enthusiasm that you could listen to her endlessly. And Sabina loved how Khalil seemed to have so many ideas. When I grow up, I'm definitely going to start my own business, and not just one, but a chain of establishments. Their friendship, which developed during breaks between classes and joint activities, quickly grew into teenage love. Although this romance was young, it already laid the foundation for future relationships, mutual support, and respect. After graduating from high school, they did not part ways, but rather entered local colleges, albeit in different majors, and spent several years combining their studies with work. Even then, their ambition stood out. Khalil worked part-time in a small coffee shop to gain management skills, and Sabina did an internship in the marketing department of a small company. They got married when they were both barely in their 20s. Sometimes friends would ask in surprise, "Isn't it too early?" But knowing the couple since high school, they were not surprised. Together, they began to build a life together, sparing no effort. Eventually, they were lucky enough to buy a house in the suburbs of Glenville, albeit on credit. The neighbors thought they were the perfect couple, both beautiful, intelligent, hardworking, always holding hands during Sunday walks. They smile at each other whenever they make eye contact. Over the years, this image seems to have only gotten stronger. When Sabina got a job as a marketing manager at a local cosmetics brand, her days were filled with advertising campaigns, approvals with designers, and negotiations with partners. She started staying late after work more often, returning home completely tired, sometimes late at night. Meanwhile, Khalil was successfully developing his dream. First, he opened a small cafe, then he managed to launch a second and third, and now he owned a small chain of restaurants that was popular in the city. He also invested in several food tech startups, which he was particularly interested in because of the potential for innovation in the food industry. Thus, the couple found themselves in a comfortable position. They had enough money for a good life, traveling, and nice purchases. They lived in a beautiful house with a bright living room, cozy kitchen, and spacious bedroom. However, the rhythms of their work schedules often did not coincide. When Sabina came home too late, Khalil might have already gone to bed or been away on a business trip. If it was his day off, she usually had to finish some presentations. No one heard them quarreling. There was a balance in the house. But sometimes it seemed that the perfection could be tired. Neighbors or friends would never have guessed that alienation would begin to emerge over time. However, at first glance, as acquaintances were accustomed to, they were the most solid couple. Their home seemed to radiate well-being, and they greeted guests with smiles and pleasant conversations. Khalil spoke enthusiastically about his restaurant future, and Sabina talked about new marketing strategies that could even promote a global brand. It seemed like their whole lives were ahead of them, and only victories were ahead. No one imagined that this perfect image would have room for great drama, betrayal, and deep pain. However, this is exactly what happens in many stories. The worst catastrophes overtake those who seem to have the strongest foundations. Sabina's mother was Gloria Williams, a woman who had lived most of her life in another neighborhood of Glenville, in a house she inherited from her first marriage. She had never been a great careerist. Her life was centered on simple household chores, some farming, and the chores around her late husband's small family business. For her daughter, she has always been an example of women's wisdom, caring, calm, and able to support her at the right time. However, as they grew older, the relationship between them became less regular. Sabina was so immersed in her career that she did not find time for frequent visits. Their phones, however, never stopped ringing. Once every few weeks or so, the two would talk. But more often than not, these were short calls. "Hi, Mom, how are you? I'm in a big hurry, but I wanted to ask if you're okay. If you're okay?" And Gloria would answer something like, "Everything's fine, dear. Take care of yourself. You're wearing yourself out with these deadlines." If the calls lasted longer, Gloria would sometimes ask how Khalil was doing, whether they were planning a new addition to the family, and whether Sabina was overworking herself. When Khalil heard these conversations from the sidelines, he mostly stayed away, although sometimes he would jokingly intervene, saying, "Tell her, Gloria, that I will definitely send her the recipe for our new signature dessert." Sometimes I could hear them laughing, and it made the house feel warmer. Gloria lived with her second husband, Sabina's stepfather. Her daughter had always been a little distant in her relationship with him. They didn't fight, but they didn't have a special friendship either. For Sabina, he was neither a source of inspiration nor an object of dislike. Rather, he was a person who simply existed in her mother's life. Therefore, when telling Khalil about family matters, Sabina often mentioned that it was difficult for her to find time to come to visit him rather than discussing domestic nuances in depth. However, an event soon happened that would turn this distance into a completely different level of communication. Gloria's life would go through a black patch, and from that moment on, everything would change dramatically. It was a cold evening outside when Sabina received a phone call that broke into her work mood like a bolt from the blue. Her neighbor Gloria's worried voice sounded in the receiver. Sabina's stepfather had died in a car accident. The phrases flew by quickly, and Sabina's heart suddenly felt as if it was running out of air. She immediately called Khalil, grabbed the car keys, and rushed out of the office, forgetting about the unfinished project and all the deadlines. On the way, her thoughts ran from shock to regret. She asked herself, "How is my mom now? What will happen to her?" She may not have had any deep attachment to her stepfather, but he was part of the family, and for Gloria, the last close person she had lived with for so many years. When Sabina arrived at her mother's house, she saw a mountain of other people's cars parked along the road. Other friends, neighbors, relatives, some of whom she did not recognize. When she went inside, she felt the air was saturated with the pressure of grief. Some people sat around Gloria, silent or stroking her shoulder, while others whispered cautiously among themselves, as if they did not want to disturb that space of grief. Gloria was sitting on the couch, looking completely devastated, her eyes staring into space, her face swollen with tears. When Gloria saw her daughter, she looked at her with a look that mixed pain, confusion, and quiet relief. Sabina came over, sat down next to her, and hugged her. For a moment, her mother was silent, and then she leaned against her and began to sob, almost silently. It seemed that all the words had disappeared, only emptiness remained. Sabina had no choice but to hold her tightly in her arms and let her tears flow. At about the same time, Khalil appeared. He too had come quickly from his restaurant, where he was taking care of business, and now stood at the door of the room, respectfully waiting for the mother and daughter to be alone first. That evening and the next few days were filled with the hectic pace of organizational worries as the funeral, the documents, and all the formalities had to be handled. Gloria suddenly found herself in a situation where it seemed to her that life had lost all its bearings. After all, she and her husband, Sabina's stepfather, had lived together for many years, and it seemed that, although she was later in life, she had found understanding and warmth. And then, at one point, everything came to an end. After the farewell ceremony, the house became so empty that she was afraid to sleep. Every corner, every small detail reminded her of him. She said, "I can see his things. There's a book on the nightstand. There's his chair. I can't stop remembering." For several weeks, Gloria lived as if on automatic. She ate through force, spoke to people automatically. Sabina tried to come more often, but she also had to fulfill her work duties, and her free time was mostly late at night. One day they were sitting there talking about the future. Gloria confessed, "It's hard for me to stay in this house. I am haunted by memories and I can't find a place for myself. Every time I go into the bedroom, I see him, hear his voice. If this continues, I will go crazy." Sabina felt she had to act. Even though she loved her mother dearly, she couldn't spend every night here. She had to find another way. And then an idea was born. Why doesn't she live with Khalil and me in Glenville? We'll be able to take care of my mom, socialize, and she won't be lonely. When Khalil heard this proposal, he supported it. This is the best solution until the bitter period is over. Gloria hesitated for a long time because she didn't want to pile on the young people with her grief. But after a few days, she finally agreed, because she really couldn't bear to be alone. So at the beginning of the next month, she arrived with her suitcases, a rather modest amount of luggage, as she decided that she would leave many things in her old house until better times come and take only the most necessary things. Sabina helped her settle in the guest room. They brought in blankets and pillows and put a small nightlight on the nightstand that Gloria loved. At first, everyone was relieved. Now Gloria was under care. It would be easier for her to get through this difficult period. And Gloria herself, despite her stiffness, was glad that she would not wake up in a dark, empty house. It seemed that the decision to move was the best one for everyone. But in reality, it was only the beginning of events that would lead to a chain of irreversible consequences. Gloria's first days in the young couple's home went surprisingly smoothly. She tried not to interfere with their usual routine. She was ashamed of the fact that she seemed to have stuck here. But Sabina was just glad that she could take care of her mother. In the mornings, she would warm up her coffee before running to the office, and in the evenings, she would tell her briefly what had happened during the day. When Khalil was home, he could sit down next to Gloria and talk to her, so she could be distracted from her sad thoughts. And so it was that Gloria and Khalil began to interact frequently. When Sabina was late, they would have dinner together, discuss television programs, or even cook some simple meals. At first, no one thought that this could lead to anything bad. But the truth was that Gloria lacked closeness and support after the loss. She wanted someone to listen carefully and comfort her. And Khalil, despite his business success, also felt a certain emotional distance from Sabina. His wife actually lived her life by work, spending little time together for recreation and sincere conversations. Not surprisingly, they began to find a lot in common in discussions about music, movies, business, and memories of the past. Gloria had experience in supporting her late husband's own business, so she was interested in asking how Khalil managed restaurants. She talked about how she used to carry the paperwork and even did some simple bookkeeping herself. Khalil admired how this woman, who had lost her husband, did not lose her interest in life. Sometimes they exchanged phrases that were already a bit flirtatious, but still remained at the level of a joke. As a result, they were getting closer emotionally every day, even though they didn't admit it directly. Gloria noticed that she was beginning to worry about whether he had eaten well or had time to rest between trips. And Khalil, although he tried to deny it, felt that he was finding in Gloria the understanding that he lacked with Sabina. Sometimes they would sit in the kitchen for hours, drinking tea, discussing various things, from the design of the restaurant's new sign to stories from her past. The passion exploded the night Sabina was frozen at work due to an urgent presentation. Gloria and Khalil were at home, alone, and everything happened naturally. They started with a conversation, then the glances became longer, and the distance between them shorter. It seems that everyone was aware that this was forbidden, but at that moment these prohibitions dissolved into thin air. They found themselves in the same bed, indulging in an uncontrollable attraction. Afterwards, they were both overcome with shock and shame. The silence of the night only intensified this feeling, and when the first rays of sunlight showed through the window, they were afraid to even look into each other's eyes. In the morning, they tried to act as if nothing had happened. They looked away, remained silent, or threw in short phrases about everyday trifles. They agreed that this should not happen again. It was a mistake. We have forgotten and moved on. However, fate and human nature are such that sometimes saying forgotten only means deepening the desire. The forbidden fruit made their imaginations continue to long for each other. There were evenings when they were alone, and one glance was enough to reignite the same spark. And even though they agreed to keep their distance, the attraction took over, and the one-time mistake was repeated. Meanwhile, Sabina was already sensing something strange in their family atmosphere. It happened more than once that, upon entering the room, she would suddenly stop the conversation between Khalil and his mother, although she did not understand what was going on. She noticed that the mother sometimes looked embarrassed and Khalil looked overly anxious. And there was a time when she found the scent of her mother's perfume on her husband's clothes, a perfume that he could not have accidentally touched. The messages that appeared on Khalil's phone screen when he forgot to unlock it were also alarming. Phrases that suggested a close conversation with someone who was definitely important. True, both Khalil and Gloria kept everything as secret as possible, but the more they tried to hide it, the more little things arose that alarmed Sabina. She intuitively felt betrayal, but her mind didn't want to believe it. How could she even imagine her husband cheating with her own mother? It all sounded crazy, but the facts were adding up, and she would soon have to face it. Gloria, who was finding it increasingly difficult to live with this burden every day, could not help but think that she was cheating on her own daughter who had taken her in her time of need. Every night she went to sleep with a sense of guilt, and every morning she woke up with the same remorse. It seemed to her that Sabina's every look was filled with suspicion that everything was about to come to light. One thought kept running through her mind. I can't live like this anymore. I have to tell her the truth. But I immediately ran into fear. What if this destroys our relationship forever? Finally, she decided to talk to Khalil about it. Late that evening, when Sabina was back at work, Gloria called him into a small office in the house. Sitting across from him, she quietly confessed, I can't take it anymore, Khalil. Every time I see her eyes, I get scared. We are living this lie and it's not right. I can't help but think that one day it will all come crashing down. Khalil seemed to be just starting to relax after a busy day at work, but he immediately turned gloomy. He knew exactly what Gloria was getting at. His face reflected a mixture of anxiety and panic. You want to confess? Confess everything? Now? She'll never forgive us. It's one of the worst betrayals imaginable. Maybe, Gloria sighed. But I can't pretend that everything is fine anymore. We're under the same roof. I see her every day. I hear her voice, and I feel empty and remorseful inside. Khalil ran his hand through his hair and closed his eyes. He was afraid of losing everything, his reputation, his marriage, his future plans, and he simply could not imagine the consequences. This panic was reflected in his voice. If we tell, can you imagine what will happen? She will throw me out, you too. We will destroy the family forever. And what will people think? Why? I don't have the strength to care what people think anymore. First of all, I feel like I'm lying to my own daughter. I don't want this life anymore. Gloria was adamant. I'm not ready, Khalil shrugged. Maybe we should wait a little while, until everything calms down, or somehow. I don't know. But Gloria kept repeating that she couldn't put it off. I'm giving you the opportunity to tell the truth with your own mouth. If you can't do it yourself, I will tell her everything that happened between us, she said. And these words became a real ultimatum for him. On the one hand, he realized that if he lost Sabina's trust, he would lose his whole world. On the other hand, he had to take into account that his mother would tell her if he did not dare. A panicked fear was born inside him. He couldn't imagine what would happen after his confession. Perhaps Sabina would never forgive him. Perhaps gossip would spread everywhere. Friends or business partners would find out about such a disgrace. But he realized that he was unlikely to stop Gloria. Gloria even blurted it out to herself at night. I'm going to tell you anyway, no matter what you think, because it's unbearable. She's guessing anyway, and I need to come clean, even if it hurts, but honestly. So now the shadow of inevitable exposure hangs over them. And as always happens in such stories, the worst thing happened at the most unpredictable moment. A chance decided everything. Sabina was supposed to return from the office later, but the workday turned upside down. Her meetings were canceled, and she was able to go home earlier than everyone expected. She did not warn anyone about this because she was not sure she would make it until the last minute. And that was the key to the denouement. When Sabina opened the door, she could hear voices in the house. And through the walls, she could hear someone arguing heatedly. It was Khalil and Gloria, and they had not expected their daughter to be here. Sabina approached the room where the noise was coming from and heard a fragment of phrases like, I can't lie anymore, and she'll find out anyway. It was Gloria's voice. A moment later, I heard Khalil's voice, filled with despair. Do you realize that this will destroy our marriage? Sabina was petrified, realizing what they were probably talking about. They were talking about treason. All the puzzle pieces came together in her brain at lightning speed. The perfume, the strange messages, the strange behavior. She flew into the room and interrupted their conversation. Everything happened instantly. Gloria and Khalil jumped in fright. Sabina's eyes were a mixture of pain, distrust, and boundless anger. "What are you talking about? I heard everything." Sabina's voice was trembling. "It's true, isn't it? You, you betrayed me. Mom, how could you?" She felt like reality was slipping away from her. She looked at Khalil, seeing confusion and shame in his eyes. She looked at her mother, who stood with her shoulders slumped, as if powerless in the face of the accusation. Gloria tried to explain something. "It was an accident, my daughter. I was desperate. I didn't mean it. We both got confused." But these words did not comfort Sabina. She just felt her heart breaking. "How? How could you?" she said, almost screaming. The quarrel broke out instantly. Sabina was sobbing and screaming at the same time, venting her anger and betrayal. Khalil tried to say a few phrases, but he couldn't manage. He either wanted to shift some of the blame to the circumstances or to justify himself, but he couldn't find the words. Gloria was shrugging her shoulders, overcome with despair. All three of them were in a state of emotional storm. That's when the worst happened. Gloria, wanting to somehow reach Khalil or stop him from being aggressive, grabbed his arm, begging him not to yell at Sabina. But in a fit of panic, he abruptly pushed her away. Either from the impact or from a misstep, Gloria slipped and hit her back against the corner of the dresser. Her scream was heard. Sabina stood there numb when she saw her mother lying on the floor, unable to get up. Gloria groaned, realizing that she had lost sensation in her legs. Shocked, Sabina and Khalil stood there for a few seconds, not believing what had happened. It was only when Gloria screamed in pain again that they rushed to her side. Sabina immediately grabbed her phone, calling an ambulance, but realized that it was too serious. The ambulance arrived quickly. The doctors, seeing Gloria's injuries, suspected that she might have suffered a fracture or serious spinal injury. She was taken to the intensive care unit, and Sabina could not recover for a long time. She had a depressing feeling as if she was in a bad dream. A few minutes ago, she learned about the bitter betrayal, and now she sees her mother lying unconscious on a stretcher. However, the development of events was not long in coming. The hospital confirmed the worst assumptions: a spinal cord injury, which means paralysis of the lower body. Gloria remains in a wheelchair. These words of the doctors sounded like a sentence for Sabina. She felt that her whole world had been destroyed. The pain in her heart was compounded by the despair of realizing that her mother would never walk again. The police did not ignore the incident either. An investigation into the infliction of grievous bodily harm was launched. Despite the fact that Khalil claimed that he meant no harm, just pushed her by accident, Gloria said that it was he who pushed her, and this was confirmed by Sabina's testimony, who saw everything with her own eyes. Law enforcement officials decided to classify Khalil's actions as a crime. The trial started quite quickly, given that the circumstances were almost obvious. Gloria said that she forgave him as a person. She did not want him to receive too severe a punishment, but the police and the prosecutor's office had their own procedures. Sabina took her mother's side. Despite her shock and anger, she told how everything looked from her perspective. After a few hearings, the judge passed the sentence. Khalil was found guilty of causing grievous bodily harm that resulted in the victim's disability. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Although he tried to explain that he did not mean it, that he was acting under the influence of emotions, the judge did not consider this as a mitigating circumstance, as the consequences were too severe. So Gloria remained in a wheelchair forever. The doctors said, "There is a minimal chance for partial rehabilitation, but it is very small." She was mentally broken. The pain of realizing her own betrayal of her daughter was superimposed on physical pain and paralysis. Rehabilitation could take a long time, and there was no prediction that she would regain full mobility. Sabina, watching her mother in the hospital, felt that her life had completely turned upside down as well. She couldn't wrap her head around how the people she cared about could betray her like that and then end up in a tragedy. She wanted to cry with despair, to scream, but she realized that she had to hold on. In the end, she made some important decisions. The memories of her betrayal, of her traumatized mother, all this seemed too painful. Plus, after the trial, he would be in prison. She would hardly have found the strength to even think about forgiving him. Sabina hired a nurse because she couldn't quit her job. and her mother needed medical care and help with mobility. She also had to find rehabilitation and physiotherapy specialists, buy a wheelchair and everything else. All those memories in the house where she and Khalil lived were now disgusting and painful. She decided to move to a different neighborhood. She rented a small apartment to distance herself from the past and start over. Meanwhile, Khalil was in custody, awaiting his trial. He realized what he had done and wrote letters to Sabina full of remorse. He recalled how they had studied together at school, made ambitious plans, loved each other, and hoped that she would respond at least once. But Sabina did not answer. It hurt her to even look at those messages, to remember him. She put them in a drawer without reading them all. I don't want to see this deception, these attempts to justify myself. Gloria, who returned from the hospital and ended up living in the same house, but now with a nurse around the clock, felt as if she were trapped. Even if she wanted to run away, her new physical condition did not allow it. All she could do was reproach herself for stopping earlier. Sabina came periodically, provided everything she needed, but no longer showed the warmth she used to. Their dialogue became cool and formal. "Mom, do you need anything? How are your medications?" Everything was polite, but without the same tenderness. My mother realized that she would probably never regain that trust. Several months passed. Sabina left her old home to distance herself from the painful memories. It was a new start for her, a new apartment, albeit a modest one, more immersion in her work at a marketing company, and frequent business trips. The wounds were still bleeding in her soul, but she tried to refocus herself. Khalil was in prison, realizing that he had not only destroyed his marriage but also crippled another person's life. He no longer wrote letters because he did not receive any responses, but only mildly regretted that he had deprived himself of everything that made sense with one emotional mistake. He had to serve his entire sentence. He had no good reason for early release. Gloria lived in the same house with a nurse. It was difficult for her to even go out into the yard because she could not move without help. Her psychological trauma was no less painful than her physical trauma. She realized that she had ruined her relationship with her daughter, and she could only sigh when she would drop by for 10-15 minutes to bring her medicine or give her money for her needs. Deep down, Gloria wanted to hug her daughter and apologize, so that everything could go back to the way it was. But it was impossible. Sabina was distant, although she formally supported her financially. In the end, life took its course. Everyone came to their own conclusions. Sabina, although left without a family, managed to find the strength to move on. At times she felt acute pain from the betrayal, but she realized that it was better to leave it in the past than to try to return or forgive. Nasara, Khalil, after serving his sentence, came out of prison a different man. He realized that his short-lived impulse with Gloria had cost him everything he had ever dreamed of. He was left with the stigma of a traitor and the culprit of a human injury. Gloria, who was confined to a wheelchair, forever retained a sense of shame in her soul. Her actions not only destroyed her daughter's marriage, but also caused irreversible changes in her own life. Her close friends were stunned when they heard the story. How is this even possible? Everyone who knew Sabina and Khalil could not believe for a long time that they could lose everything because of such a senseless betrayal. The ending of this story, although not a happy one, taught each of them that emotional honesty and the ability to communicate openly are key things that can prevent terrible consequences. Instead of simple petty quarrels or conversations, they all experienced a tragedy that changed several lives and left indelible scars. Sometimes a single moment of weakness can cause a catastrophe that leaves no room for turning back. The bottom line is that betrayal is always painful and challenging, but when it is combined with carelessness, lack of sincere explanations, and the words "I'm sorry," the consequences can be much worse than anyone can imagine.